In this video, I will teach you the basic rules of chess. I'll start by explaining what files and ranks are. So files are these vertical lines that run along the board. And the reason this is important is because when you are setting up a chessboard, so files are the vertical lines. So they run from A to H, and the ranks, which go horizontal, run from 1 to 8. And so most chess boards will have these letters which represent the files and the numbers which represent the ranks. And the reason that's important is because if they do have the letters and numbers, the white pieces will go on the first rank, the white pawns will go on the second rank, and the black pawns will go on the seventh rank. The black pieces will go on the eighth rank. And if they don't have the letters and numbers here, an easy way to remember it, I'll write this down, is that bottom right should be a white square. So this square here is a white square, so we know that the board is set up correctly. If the board was flipped 90 degrees, then this would be the bottom right square, and that would not be correct. And that's going to matter later on when we get to notation. We'll focus on that later in the lesson. So for now, I'm going to show you how to set up. So the simplest way to set up is you take the pawns, you set them up on every square on the second rank. So that's the white pawns. And then you're going to take the black pawns and you're going to put them on every square on the seventh rank. And once again, if you don't have the numbers on your board, you're just going to look at it. You're going to make sure that there's a white square in the bottom right corner, and then you're going to look at the board from that perspective, and you're just going to say, okay, my pieces are going to go on the first rank, and my pawns are going to go on the second rank. And the same thing if you were looking from the other perspective, if you were up here on top and you were looking from black's perspective, you would just know that on your first rank is where your pieces would go and your pawns would go on the second rank. Okay, so once we have the pawns set up, the rooks always go in the corners. So that's very simple to know. And if you do have the letters and numbers, they're going to go on the A and H files. The knights always go next to the rooks. The bishops go next to the knights. So with the king and the queen, this is something that people get mixed up a lot. They will put the king and the queen on the wrong square. So if you have the letters and numbers, the kings are always going to go on the E file and the queens will always go on the D file. If you don't, then once again, you're going to make sure that this bottom right square is a white square. If it is, then your king, if you're on the white side, your king will be on the right side of the board. If you're on the black side, if you're looking from black's perspective, right now we're looking from white's perspective. If we flip the board, the black king will always be on the left side of the board and the right king will be on the right side next to the bishops. Okay, so that's how we set up the board. Now I'm going to teach you how each piece moves. So we have the pawns. We'll start with the pawns. And the pawns, when they first move, they can move 2 squares forward. But after they've already moved, so let's say we move this 2 squares forward. After they've already moved, they can only move 1 square forward. So we can't go here to E6. We can only go to E5. So simple way to remember it, when the pawns have not moved at all, they can move 2 squares or 1 square. But after they've already moved, they can only move 1 square at a time. So in terms of how pawns, so that's just how they move. But if you want to take one of your opponent's pieces, well, you have to take diagonally. So if this pawn was here, I cannot capture this pawn by moving forward. I can only capture it by moving diagonally. And that's different to every other piece in chess. Pawns capture in a different way to how they move if they were not capturing. Okay, so we've got some information there about pawns. Now, knights are tricky pieces to move. So they move in an L shape. So they move two squares in one direction and one square in another direction. So let's say with these knights, it could go two squares forward and one square to the left. So it could end up on F3. It could move two squares forward and one square to the right. It could end up on H3, or it could move one square forward and two squares to the left, and it would end up on E2. So it looks like a capital L. And obviously it can't go to the right because this is the side of the board here. If there was another square, well, it would go next to H2. Okay, so that's the knights. Now the bishops can only move diagonally, and they can only move on the color of square that they start on. So this bishop will never be able to move on to a dark square because it started on a light square. Same thing with this bishop that starts on a dark square. It would never be able to go onto a light square. So we're just going to put this bishop here. And so the king can usually only move one square at a time in any direction. But there is a rule in chess called castling, which enables the king to get away from the center of the board, these four central squares, and it enables the king to move two squares across. This is the only time that the king can move two squares. So the king could move to F1, it could move to E2, and that would be moving one square at a time. But when it's castling, the king can move to G1 and the rook will come to the other side on F1. So I'll show you how that works. So if you're playing online, all you have to do is click the king. Well, it depends on how you've got it set up in your settings, but I think as you start, this is how it's set up. All you have to do is click the king or drag the king, drag it to the G1 square, and the rook will automatically come to the other side. If you were going to do it with physical pieces in a board, you would just pick up the king, you would take it to the G1 square, and then the rook, and then you would take the rook to the F1 square. So the king will always move two squares when it's castling, and the rook will just come to the other side. If so, this is castling to the right. We can also castle to the left. So let's just say we got out, we'd have to move these other pieces. So I'm going to explain the rules of castling very shortly, but let's just do it like this. So now we've got all the pieces out of the way, and we can also castle to the left. So if we castle to the left from white's perspective, we call that queenside castling because the queen starts on D1. So it's the queen's side of the board. From black's perspective, it would be castling to the right, and we would call that queenside castling. If we go back and we want to castle kingside, so the king side of the board, once again, we call that kingside castling. So the rules for castling is that no pieces can be blocking the king's pathway. So let's say we have this position here. Okay, so black is going to come here and attack the king. The king cannot go, currently the bishop is attacking the king. If the king is being attacked, the king cannot castle. It cannot go to G1 because the bishop is also covering the G1 square. So it can go to F1 and it can go to E2, but it cannot go to G1 because then the king would be moving into check. Okay, and also if we move the rook at any time, if we move it to G1 or F1, or if there was another square for it to move, let's say we move it to G1, and now we move it back to H1, the king cannot castle because the rook has moved. So now the king can no longer castle this way. But the king can castle the other way. Once all the other pieces move out of the way, the kings can castle the other way. So this rook has moved, so we can't castle this way, but we can castle that way because this rook has not moved. And as we can see, we have to move all the other pieces out of the way because how could I put my king on G1? The knight's already there, right? And even if the bishop is in the way, I can't go to G1 because my rook cannot come to F1. So the other pieces have to be out of the way. Same thing if you're castling queenside. Even though no piece is going to go to B1, so let's look at it like that. No pieces, the king will not go to B1, the king will go to C1. Once again, if we're castling queenside, the king will always move 2 squares and the rook will just come to the other side. So when we're castling kingside, the rook is moving 2 squares. When we're castling queenside, the rook is moving 3 squares, but that doesn't matter. It's always about the king. The king is going to move 2 squares in one direction and the rook just comes to the other side. So, as I was saying, if we want to castle queenside, our king is going to go to C1 and our rook is going to go to D1 because the king's going 2 squares, the rook's just coming to the other side. So nothing's going to B1, but we still need to move the knight because the rook cannot jump over the knight. All of these 3 squares need to be clear in order for castling to occur. Okay, so that's how the king moves. And the queen, can move as far as it wants. There's no limit on it. Same with the bishop, actually. The bishop can move as far as it wants in a diagonal direction. There's no limit. Once again, the king can only move 1 square in any direction. The knight can only move in this L shape. But as for the rook, queen, and bishop, they can move as far as they want, but there's certain rules in terms of which ways they can move. So as we've already said, the bishop can move diagonally and it can only stay on the color that it started on. The white square is this one, and on the dark square is this one. And the queen can move, or actually, let's go to the rook first. So the rook cannot move diagonally. The bishop can move diagonally. The rook can only move horizontally and vertically, as long as nothing's blocking its way. The knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So at the moment, the rook can only go to this square. But let's say this rook was over here. It could move up like that or down, and it could move across. But it can't move here because the pawn's in the way and it can't jump over the pawn. Same thing with this pawn. It can't jump over that pawn and it can't jump over this pawn. So it can only move, the rook can only move horizontally and vertically. The queen is a combination of the rook and the bishop. It can move horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. So often that's why we call the queen the strongest piece, because the queen is able to move in ways that the other pieces can't. The knight is also unique in the way it moves, but it can't cover as much distance as the queen. It doesn't have as many options as the queen. The queen is going to have the most options, especially when the board is open. At the moment, there's so many pieces on the board, so the queen only has 3 squares to move to. But once a lot of pieces go off the board, we can imagine that the queen might be able to move from here all the way to here, and all the way across there. And no other piece, if the queen was on H8 and nothing was on these diagonals, this file and this rank, the queen would be able to move to H1, A1, and A8. And no other piece would be able to move to those 3 squares from the H8 square. That's what makes the queen so powerful. Okay, so we've gone over how all the pieces move, and we've gone over castling. I want to go over one quick other exception to how pawns move. So let's go and let's move the pawn up to the 5th rank. So I'm going to show you it from white's perspective first, and then I'll show you from black's perspective. So we saw before that the pawns can only capture diagonally. This pawn cannot take this pawn like this because pawns move in a different way to how they capture. So we can capture like this, but we can't capture like that. See, it won't let me do it. Okay? If I move forward to the fifth rank, if I'm white, so if I'm white, I will only be able to do this when my pawn is on the fifth rank. And if we remember how pawns move, this pawn can either move to the d6 square or it can move to the d5 square. So if it moves to the d6 square, well, that's diagonal. I can take it. If it moves to the d5 square, I can also take it. This is a rule called en passant. So I still take diagonally. My pawn is going to end up behind the pawn, but only if the pawn hasn't moved, only if it moves 2 squares forward. So if I'm white, that can only happen on the fifth rank. So if the pawn moves 2 squares forward, I will take diagonally. I will take this d5 pawn off the board and my pawn will move to d6. So let's look at it from black's perspective. Okay, so this, from black's perspective, it could only happen on the fourth rank because a white pawn can only move 2 squares forward to the fourth rank. And once again, if this pawn moved here, we would just take diagonal. We could take diagonally. If it moves 2 squares forward, we can do what's called en passant. We'll take diagonally, we'll take behind the pawn, and this e4 pawn will come off the board. Also, I wanted to make it clear, I didn't make this clear in my last video. If at any moment you have questions about anything that I say, you can post a comment on the video, or also I'll put my email in the description if you want to ask a private question. Feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to explain any questions that you have. So that's en passant. Can be a little bit confusing, and in tournament play, I've seen a lot of people come to tournaments and they see that for the first time and they get quite annoyed and quite confused. So that is a difficult one. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Okay, so we've gone over files and ranks. Now we're getting to something called promotion. Okay, so let's clear the board. Okay. So if we get to this position here, anytime so all the white pawns are going to start on the second rank, all the black pawns are going to start on the seventh rank. So if my pawn gets all the way up to the seventh rank, if a white pawn ever reaches the eighth rank, it could become a queen, a rook, a knight, or a bishop. Now, as we know, a queen can move in the same way as a rook and a bishop. So there would be no point getting a rook and a bishop, but it's still an option. The knight can move in a different way. So in some very special exceptions, you might want to get a knight, which is called under promotion, which we're not going to talk about in depth here. But in most circumstances, if one of your pawns gets to the other side of the board, you're going to want to get a queen. And as we know, queens are much more powerful than the pawns in general because they can cover many more squares, they have many more options, and it's a lot easier to checkmate with a queen. So we're going to, if your pawn gets to the other side, and if you're white, then you can get a queen on the eighth rank. If you're black, then your pawns are going to start on the seventh rank. You're going to push up to the first rank, and you'd be able to get a queen on the first rank. So that's called promotion. So we just had a pawn, it got to the other side, and it became a queen. That's called promotion. And that's also called a check. So in chess, the goal of the game is to checkmate the black king. Okay, so what that means, if a check is when one of my pieces is aligned with the black king and nothing is blocking its path. Okay, so let's imagine that. Let's imagine that I put a rook here and I put a bishop and I put a knight here. So my rook is aligned with the black king, but this knight is blocking this alignment, so that's not a check. If I take this knight off the board, well, let's move it here. If I move my rook here, see we get this red highlight. So if you're playing online, you'll get something like this, and this red highlight will let you know that your king is in check. If you're playing in a real game, then you're just going to have to discern that yourself. But as I said, anytime a piece is aligned with your king and nothing is blocking the path, that's what we call check. So with a rook, in this circumstance, is horizontal. If we put the rook here, it would be a vertical check. If we get rid of the rook and we put a bishop here, that is a diagonal check. Okay, so there's many different ways to check, but as I said, anytime a piece, and it all depends on how the piece moves. So as we know, bishops move diagonally, so a bishop could never check horizontally because that's not how it moves. Bishops move diagonally. So if a bishop is diagonally aligned with a king and nothing is blocking that diagonal, then that's what we call a check. Okay, so that's check. Now checkmate means that the king has nowhere to move. It has nothing to block the check and nothing can capture this bishop. So let's go over that one at a time. So as we saw here, the king has 1, 2, 3, 4 squares that it could move to. It cannot move to the f7 square because the bishop is still covering that square. So it would still be in check if it moved to f7, but it can move here, 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 here because nothing is attacking those squares. Okay, so that's the first way to get out of a check. You can move the king. So let's imagine that there's pieces in the way. So that's check, and the king cannot move. See, all these 4 squares before have been that we had to move to have been taken up by black's pieces. So an alternative is you can block the check. And the only thing that can block the check, that move into this path onto one of these 2 squares, is the knight. So the knight blocks the check. The bishop can take the knight, but now the king has a square to go to. Before, the knight was in the way. Now the knight has moved out of the way and the king has a square to move to. Okay, so we've looked at moving the king to get out of check and we've looked at blocking the check. Now, let's look at an alternative. Let's look at capturing the piece that's giving check. So we know the king cannot move. These squares are taken and this square is being controlled by the bishop. We know we can block the check. We can do that, but we can also take the bishop and it's no longer check. Okay, so those are your 3 options if you're in check. You can move your king away. If that's not an option, potentially you can block the check with the knight, or if you can, you could potentially take the piece that's giving check. So that's check and the 3 ways to get out of check. Now let's look at checkmate. Okay, so we're looking at the king here. Okay, so in this circumstance, we're going to move the king down here and we're going to give check. The queen is aligned. The king cannot move to e8 or g8 because the queen controls those squares. If the king moved to either of those squares, the queen would just take the king. Also, in chess, you never actually take the king off the board. You attack the king, that's check. Then if the king cannot move anywhere, if it can't block the check, and if it can't capture the piece that's giving check, that's what we call checkmate. But we never actually take the king off the board. We never actually capture the king. Right, so the king cannot go to either of these squares because the queen is controlling these squares. And the king cannot go to either of these squares because the rook is controlling those squares. So that's what we would call checkmate. Let's go to stalemate. Okay, so it's white to move. If I move the white queen here, the king's not in check. These pieces are not aligned because remember, a queen does not move like a knight. It doesn't move in this L shape. Two across, one up, or one up, two across. The queen could only check the king if the king was on any of these squares, because that's the way the queen moves, or these as well. See, we can see how many squares the queen actually covers. And I was talking about before how powerful the queen is. Look at all these squares that the queen controls. It's quite amazing. So, but it doesn't move like a knight. So we can see how each piece plays its role because the queen cannot move like a knight. If the knight was here and the king was here, that would be check. But the queen cannot move like a knight, therefore it's not check. But this black king has nowhere to move. If it moved here, the queen would take. If it moved here, the queen would take. If it moved here, the queen would take. Those are the only three squares not the king can possibly move to, but what could possibly move to if the queen wasn't here. But the queen is here, and it's blocking the king from coming to all these squares. But it's not a check. There's no alignment here. So this is what we call stalemate because it's not check, but black cannot make any moves. So stalemate ends up in a draw. Okay, so the last thing I want to go over is what we call notation. So we're going to go to this starting position. We're going to open the analysis board and quickly I'm going to make this the whole screen so that you can see. Okay, so let's say we make this move. See how we have this E4 here on the right? So we can see that the pawn started on E2 and it moved to E4. And now up here on the right, the pawn has moved to E4 and we're showing what's called notation. Okay, so if this pawn moves to E5, well, now it's going to show up with E5 here. So this is how we record the moves of a chess game. And the primary reason we do this is because if you're playing in a tournament and both players write down their moves, then the game is recorded. And if there's a dispute between the players over what has happened, then the person who is organizing the tournament can look at what the players have written down. They can go through the game move by move and they can try to resolve the dispute because eventually there's going to be some sort of deviation in the way that the players have written down the moves, or one player has going to have written down the moves incorrectly. And they will find some way to resolve that dispute. There are slightly complicated ways that happens, which is not the purpose of this video. But as I said, the main purpose of writing down the notation is to make sure that there's a record of the moves that have been played to resolve disputes. If players are saying, oh, you moved that piece there, or no, I thought you moved it there, well, you're supposed to write it all down. And so then they would be able to resolve that dispute somehow. Okay, so with the pawns, we don't write pawn E4 or capital P E4. We just write down E4 and E5. But with the rest of the pieces, as we're going to see, with the knight, we write down N F3 because the knight started on G1, it moved to F3. A knight starts with the letter K, but we don't use the letter K because the king also starts with the letter K and the king can never leave the board. Therefore, the king takes the letter K so we don't get confused between N and K. Well, knight and king. If we use K for both pieces, that would be a bit confusing. So, as I said, the king can never leave the board. King will always stay on the board until checkmate. The knights could leave the board. These knights could all be captured. They could all be taken off the board. Therefore, the king is going to be on the board longer, so we may as well use the K for the king. Okay, so let's bring the other knight out. Knight C6. The knight has moved from B8 to C6, so we call that capital N C6. So if we're talking about the letters of where it's moving, we use a lowercase letter. If we're talking about the type of piece that was moved, we use a capital case letter. So then we'll go bishop c4, bishop c5. And now, if I move the king to F1, we could see it's king F1, K F1. If I want to castle, that's going to be 0 dash 0. And if I want to castle the other way, it's going to be 0 dash 0 dash 0. So if we're going to castle king side, it'll be 0 dash 0. And if we're going to castle queen side, it'll be 0 dash 0 dash 0. Okay. And as we can see here, when we move the queen, capital Q E2. And when we move this bishop, it was capital B C4. So it's always the type of piece that you move first, and that's in an uppercase letter. And then what comes after that is lowercase letter of the square you're moving it to. So this is the C4 square, so it's a lowercase c and 4. So those are the basics. That's the basics of notation. There's some slightly more complicated things than that, but actually what I will show you, one last thing I will show you is when something is captured, it's E. So this pawn's on E4 and this pawn's on D5. So the E pawn is capturing the D5 pawn. So as we can see here, it's E takes D5, and the capturing is notated by this X. And that wouldn't matter what you take with. If we had, let's say we go this one. So here it's knight, capital N, takes D4. So it doesn't matter what piece you take with, whatever you're moving, as we said, with pawns, we don't write capital pawn E4. We just say the square it's moving to. And then we know it was a pawn because it doesn't have anything before it. With everything else, we write the type of piece that was moved first. We use the capital letter, and remember that knight is N and king is K, even though they both start with K. And then bishop is obviously B, Q, and R. And then no matter what takes, we start with the letter of the piece, then we put an X to signify that something was captured, and then we say which square the piece moved to, and then we know what was captured, because sometimes multiple things could be captured. So that's the basics of notation. So I think that has been a really simple introduction to chess for you. And once again, if you have any questions, feel free to post a comment, or I will put my email in the description. And I would love to hear from you. And please give me feedback on what you would like to see in a future video. Thank you.